Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Day of Infamy for PC, Mac, and Linux. This is a tactical first-person shooter developed by New World Interactive, and it was released out of early access last month, March of this year. And if you're wondering, wait a minute DW, I thought you did a review of this already. No, I did not. I did an MTO video on the early access build as of August of last year. So if you're curious how the game was in early access, go ahead and give that video a look, but now the full release is here. They've done some considerable amount of polishing up since the early access build, and they've added more content as well. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with and whether or not it's worth playing. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's very comparable to New World Interactive's previous game, which was Insurgency. It runs in the Source engine, and unlike, say, Titanfall or Titanfall 2, it feels like a Source engine game as well. This means that while the modeling and animations are generally very well done and rather well detailed, the texture quality is not quite as good as you might hope it would be. It's still good, it's just not super high res or anything. Although if you take into account that it's an indie game, it becomes a bit easier to forgive that. And there really aren't any impressive visual effects that are going to make this thing look a cut above the rest. In fact, this game really is not very far removed in terms of its visual quality from Day of Defeat's Source, which came out 7 years ago. That means that despite having a lot of elements that do look rather good, this still ends up looking fairly dated when you really get down to it. Now luckily that's just a mild disappointment because it's not like this game is ugly or anything. It still looks good, it's just it doesn't look as good as it could on, say, Unreal Engine or something like that. But then we move over into sound design, and that's where things get a lot messier, because you have sound effects that range from actually fairly good, like the explosions, which don't have quite as much bass as I would really like, but it's pretty close, to not so great like some of the gun sounds. While the weapons certainly sound better than a lot of, say, Call of Duty's weapons, that's not really saying all that much. And you're still left with gun sounds that do not sound anywhere near as good as they could. If they made them a bit beefier, then that would really help things a lot in the long run, because as it stands, they just are alright at best. Then you move over into music, and it's what I would describe as relatively generic World War II FPS fare. It's orchestral stuff that is clearly inspired by the likes of Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, but also older World War II movies as well. And really the only thing distinguishing it from other World War II games is that it's a bit lower-fi than what you would expect from, say, a big AAA production. It's honestly quite yawn-inducing. But what's not yawn-inducing is the voice acting, which is actually really well done in this thing. Soldiers will automatically react to things that are going on around them. So, for example, when they toss a grenade, they'll yell out to their team that they're doing that. If they are getting shot at and it's coming really close, then they'll start throwing expletives all over the place. It actually ends up sounding surprisingly organic and works extremely well for the game. In fact, the battle chatter is strong enough that it elevates the sound design a bit more than what you would think after having heard what I previously told you about the sound effects themselves as well as the music. But all the battle chatter in the world wouldn't help this thing if the story and gameplay weren't up to snuff. Well, let's face it, it's all up to the gameplay, because the story in this is, it's World War II, you're fighting in the European theater, and you're either playing as the Brits, the Americans, or the Germans, and that's it. It's a multiplayer game. It is focused almost exclusively on the gameplay. Now, what does that mean for the actual game? Well, this is a bit different from your normal first-person shooters out there because it plays like Red Orchestra or Insurgency, which means that you don't have a static aiming position. You have free aim, and then whenever you want to actually aim at things precisely, then you go into iron sight mode. You can take barely any damage before going down in this thing, and in most cases, you'll go down in about one shot. Particularly if it's a rifle or a flamethrower, but more on the flamethrowers later. And because of this, you are pretty much forced into playing this in a rather slow and methodical manner. Trying to run and gun like you would in, say, Call of Duty or something like that will just get you mowed down in seconds. What you're really supposed to do is take things nice and slow, go ahead and use cover as much as you possibly can, and work together with your team in order to advance toward the objectives. Because this is an objective-driven game. You have basically two modes of play. The first of these is two modes that I actually roll into one, and those are the single player and the co-op. Because the single player is literally just you playing through the co-op missions except by yourself. And the other mode is the versus multiplayer. Now, co-op has you going up against AI enemies in order to complete various objectives. Most of the time, it's go to this point and hold it until eventually you capture that point, and then you can move on to the next one. If it's not something like that, then more likely you're going to hold off waves upon waves of enemy soldiers. And apart from the occasional objective that has you destroy something instead of just capture it, there's really not a lot of variety to the co-op mode. Luckily, one of the bigger complaints I had about the early access release has been at least somewhat remedied. The AI is no longer as dumb as a sack of hammers, it's almost as dumb as a sack of hammers. They'll still get stuck on the environment, sure, they'll still occasionally go wandering off and you'll have no idea what they're doing, and occasionally they'll just hang back and do absolutely nothing, but unlike in the early access release that I played, they're actually pretty good shots this time around. They will react to you pretty quickly, and they will take you out pretty quickly if you're not careful. This adds considerably more value to the single-player and co-op experience than was in the early access build, because in the early access build it was, frankly, ridiculously easy. Now it actually poses some degree of a challenge, which definitely makes it a lot more rewarding. But really the meat of the game is going to be in its versus multiplayer, which has a couple of game modes that mostly consist of capture this point and force the enemy to defend at the next point. Sometimes that's enforced by the rule set, and other times it's more of a matter of, well, they need to capture the point back in order to keep progressing. It sounds simple enough, and it is. The problem is that there's not really a huge amount of variety in the objectives themselves. Much like in the co-op, it's gonna basically just be hold this position or capture this position, and not much more than that. That ends up being alright though, because the main focus is not on the objectives themselves, it's on the team interactions. This is a very team and squad oriented game. The idea is that you work together with your team within the classes that you're given in order to complete the various objectives. When you start a map up, you're going to be given a list of classes that you can choose from for your given side, and once you pick that class, then you're able to select a loadout. Now each of the classes does have a specific bonus that they get. For example, the Assault class is a bit faster moving. But each of the classes does have its own specific weapons available as well. So, for example, the Assault classes have shotguns and submachine guns available to them, whereas a sniper only gets a single kind of bolt-action rifle, or a rifleman might get access to a bolt-action rifle as well as a semi-automatic rifle. It just depends on the faction. And you are able to customize your loadout at least to some degree, what you want to prioritize. Because that's based entirely on the supply points that you're given. Now, supply points can increase depending on which mode you're playing, either by capturing objectives, being forced back to other objectives, or just getting a certain number of kills. Obviously, with more supply points, you get access to more stuff, so you might be able to carry more grenades, or you might be able to customize your rifle a bit more. So instead of just it being a plain old rifle, now you might be able to put in stripper clips to make loading faster, or you might be able to put a sling on it so that now you can switch between other weapons faster. Or if you don't want to do something like that, and you have plenty of supply points left over, you can always opt for a secondary weapon. Thing is, you have to be careful with that because some sidearms are better than others. For example, the Webley is actually really powerful, whereas the high power is practically useless. It's a bit ironic, but you would think that a 9mm handgun would do the same damage as another 9mm handgun. Apparently it doesn't, however, because the other 9mm handguns in this game do considerably more damage than the high power does. Or at least it seems like it, because I've unloaded the high power into enemies at almost point blank, and they still manage to take me out before I take them out. So obviously the issue of balancing that was in the early access build is still a bit of a problem here. It's less of a problem because I've noticed that everything is generally a lot more balanced now, but you very quickly find out that there are just certain weapons that are either ridiculously overpowered or ridiculously underpowered. Case in point, the Flamethrowers, where it seems like if you get even vaguely touched with a flamethrower, you instantly die. Now, in theory, a flamethrower is extremely dangerous to its user because somebody could hit the tank and then it will just instantly ignite on you, or they could take you out at a longer range. Problems with that being that the hit detection on the flamethrower tanks is a bit iffy, and more importantly, the flamethrower actually has a pretty long range, thus making them kind of infuriating to deal with. Luckily, the game has built-in limits as to how many flamethrower troopers can be on the field at any given point, so it's not something you'll have to deal with from everybody, but it's still really irritating to have to deal with it at all. But regardless of what you have in your loadout, what you really need to do is work together as a team in order to complete the objectives. Because if you don't do that, then your whole team's just going to constantly get mowed down, you're going to run out of reinforcement waves, and you're going to lose the match. So how do you work as a team? Well, each of the classes does have its own specific niche. For example, the Assault class is good at getting in there and just mowing down a bunch of dudes at once. Flamethrowers serve as pretty handy area denial tools to prevent the enemy from getting in pretty close. Riflemen provide mid and long range fire support, whereas the snipers provide very long range fire support. And of course, if you have a radio man or other people carrying radios as well as officers on your team, then they'll be able to support your team with supply drops or artillery strikes or other forms of airstrikes or calling in smoke on various points, all sorts of things like that. And if you get a team where everybody is playing their roles really well and is actually working together as a team really well and everybody's communicating, then the game is an absolute joy. There are, however, several problems with this. First problem. Communication is generally very poor in the community. In a game this team-oriented, you really do need to communicate with your team effectively in order to win, and a lot of people will either say absolutely nothing at all, or they'll say nothing helpful. Now, part of that may just be that normally when I'm playing this thing, it's relatively late at night, so people aren't necessarily wanting to communicate all that much to begin with, and part of it's just the fact that I'm playing with random people online, but another part of it is that I think most people are just not used to communicating with their team. They are way too used to games where they play in a very individualistic manner. I'm even guilty of this myself to some degree. If you haven't played a very team-oriented FPS for quite a while, then it's going to take you a bit of time to get back in the groove of things. And if you're not used to communicating with your team at all in any game, then that's going to be a serious problem for you. And it's something that I've found the community suffers from in general. There's just not all that much communication going on, and it ends up kind of ruining the experience. It also doesn't help that the skill level for this game is a fair bit higher than your typical arcadey style Call of Duty, for example, run and gun shooter. Precision is emphasized, and a lot of people are just not very precise. And you may be one of those people who thinks, oh, well, that's okay, I'm not really all that precise with rifles in first-person shooters, so I'll just pick, say, a submachine gun or a shotgun and just kind of fire from the hip. Well, it doesn't really work all that well. Sure, if you're good at first-person shooters, then you're going to have this sort of innate ability to point and shoot, but it's still not going to be anywhere near as precise as being able to use your sights and take your time. And for a lot of gamers, that's just not what they want out of a first-person shooter. But really, that's not the biggest problem this game suffers from. The biggest problem it suffers from is the simple question of why. In a more micro level within the game, why are there microtransactions for cosmetic items, and why are these things that you earn through play? I don't know, I guess because that's just something that modern games are supposed to have. You do gradually rank up over time, and as you do, you get access to different cosmetics for the various factions. So you can play as, say, a certain infantry regiment, or you can play as Canadians, or you can play as the Scots, or whatever it may well be. Doesn't have any effect on what gear you have available, it just has an effect on what your character looks like in-game. And while you can unlock them through just normal play, you can also unlock them with microtransactions of, I believe, about $7 or $8 a piece, and that's actually quite expensive for something that is really not important at all. But really, the bigger concern is, why does this game exist at all? It started life as a mod for Insurgency, and from there it just turned into a full standalone game that they're charging $20 for. Now, this game's progenitor has a place in the market because Red Orchestra didn't concern itself with the modern theater. It's all World War II until you get to Rising Storm 2 Vietnam. But even that doesn't fit into the same niche. Day of Infamy, on the other hand, is basically just a cut-down version of Red Orchestra 2 with radio mechanics and not much more than that. Well, that and it takes place on the Western Front and has way less content. Although, to be fair, this game did just come out pretty recently, and Red Orchestra 2 has been out for a couple of years at this point. But even when it was released, Red Orchestra 2 still had more content than this does, and now it's just not even a contest. Why would you pick this over Red Orchestra 2? I'm really not all that sure. About the only thing this has that Red Orchestra 2 doesn't is the British faction, and that's really not that much of a consolation prize. But I think the biggest question here is, why would you play this over the mod version? Sure, the mod version's less refined, but it's free as long as you own the base game. In fact, I think a lot more people are playing the mod version than the full release. Because if you look at the player counts, then it's not even a contest. The all-time peak, as far as I can tell when I looked at Steam charts for Day of Infamy, was just under 1,500 players. That's almost 1,000 less than the 24-hour peak of the game that spawned it. And I think that really says everything that needs to be said about Day of Infamy. It's not a bad game. It's actually a fairly solid game. It's just that it never needed to exist. And its general performance seems to reflect that. And unless they do a major content update, I really don't see this thing staying alive for very long, which is a bit of a shame. If they had done something like, say, the Vietnam War, or even gone to Korea or something like that, then maybe it would have been a much more interesting experience, and maybe it would have performed better. But as it stands, I really can't give this thing any more than a 3 out of 5. It's decent, it runs well, it plays well, but I really don't see this thing surviving for much more than maybe a year or two. Now, I could be proven wrong on the longevity of this thing, but let's face it, there's just better options out there for a World War II shooter of this style. Thanks for watching.